The summer heat in Red Valley did not simply arrive. It pressed in, an invisible hand flattening the mesquite, bending the cotton flags over porches, driving anyone with sense to the riverbanks or the irrigation canals that stitched the town together like rough thread. It was July 12, 2001, and the asphalt looked soft enough to take a thumbprint. In that white-hot air, 19-year-old Mia Torres, youngest child of a Mexican immigrant family, wide smile, a soft laugh that neighbors still remember, slipped into a simple summer dress for a classmate's birthday. The party spilled from a garage, golden bulbs strung like a constellation, cumbia shaking the fence while neighborhood kids clapped along outside. By night's end, sometime around 11, maybe midnight depending on who you ask, Mia headed for the red pickup she'd borrowed from her cousin, promising to go straight home so her parents wouldn't worry. At the Torres house off a dusty road, Elena watched the window as if it were a clock, and the glass could tell her where her daughter was. Roberto dozed in his chair with the porch light burning, the unspoken code in small towns. We're awake. We're waiting. The hour pushed past midnight, and then past that again. Front yards across Red Valley settled into that desert silence that feels like a held breath. But at the Torres place, the porch light made a lone halo, a reminder to anyone passing that this home had someone still out on the road. When the red sun shouldered up over the mountains and Mia hadn't walked in, Elena shook Roberto awake. Within minutes, they were on the phone with the county, making a report. No parent rehearses, but every parent knows by heart, our daughter didn't come home. The Coconino County Sheriff's Office launched what locals would later call the biggest search the town had ever seen. Helicopters beat the sky, dogs traced damp scents along canal banks. Divers worked the green, slow-moving water and the deeper desert lakes that swallow trucks and secrets with equal patience. July in Arizona is a warning label. The ground had cracked into pale seams. Cactus spines looked like 1,000 pointing fingers. Even the wind could feel sharp. Searchers moved in lines, spaced like careful stitches, eyes down for fabric edges, scuffs, anything that didn't belong to sand and rock. Volunteers poured in, church ladies handing out water, farmhands still in work boots, kids in ball caps taping flyers with Mia's school portrait under bold red letters that said missing. Red Valley had never been more united. It had also never been so afraid. Near a canal, half a mile from a route Mia could have taken, someone found a single white sandal. There was a faint tire mark too, curved like someone had stopped hard and turned back. But the desert is a poor archivist. Wind and footsteps smudged the lines faster than anyone could photograph them. The discovery shifted the search. Canals became the focus. People who'd never met the Torres family walked shoulder to shoulder across the dust as if they could will the ground to give her back. Reporters came from Flagstaff and Phoenix, microphones, catching Elena's voice when it shook and Roberto's when it didn't. But 7 days can be a lifetime on hot sand. At the end of a week, there was nothing. No body, no truck, no reason. Just a town that had thought of itself as peaceful learning how quickly a person could disappear. Detectives did what detectives do when the earth won't answer. They turned to people. They started with Daniel Ortiz, the ex-boyfriend, 20 years old, same high school, the kind of young couple that argues in parking lots loud enough that neighbors remember the date for years. He sat in the cold interview room more than once, long hours, and the same questions asked different ways, but security footage from his gas station shift made him look like a wallpapered fact. He was behind the counter the night Mia left the party. From there, the net widened. There was an older co-worker at the grocery store where Mia bagged after school, rumors that he took too much interest, questions that veered past work. He claimed he was home with family. No physical evidence dragged him into the present tense. Police even asked the hard questions close to the Torres home, relatives, the cousin who'd loaned the red truck. It's a necessary cruelty in investigations. Trust no one, not yet. Partygoers offered a chorus that never settled into harmony. Someone swore she left at 11. Someone else said nearly midnight. Another remembered seeing her in the lot, talking to a man, but the face slid away every time he tried to pin it down. The red pickup should have been the anchor, the thing you tie a story to, but it vanished as completely as Mia did. No traffic camera caught it leaving town. No gas station clerk remembered a red bed rolling in for fuel. The desert doesn't need rain to wash things clean. 6 months later, the funding thinned, the volunteer list shortened, and the case file grew a stiff cardboard spine stamped with a word that feels like a verdict even when it isn't: unsolved. Torn posters gave way to plumbers' ads and real estate flyers. On weekends, a handful of relatives and friends still drove dusty roads as if grief could be navigated like a map. Every July 12th, the Torres family held vigil outside the small-town church, candles stuttering in the breeze, Mia's picture propped against a wooden table. Each year, fewer people came. Each year, Elena's eyes looked a little more like someone who had spent too much time trying to make sense of an empty room. In those early months and the years that followed, law enforcement's challenge was both obvious and invisible. Without a body, prosecutors don't have time of death, cause of death, or even proof of death at all, just an absence that feels true but can't stand up in court by itself. Without the truck, investigators lacked the crime scene that most likely held the story: interior fibers, fingerprints wiped but not fully, hair caught in upholstery staples, glass chips, gouges along the rocker panel that could tell a different tale than an accident. Red Valley had canals, not rivers with current, and even so, vehicles can settle under silt and cattail roots, invisible to aerial searches and stubborn under sonar unless you know where to look. In 2001, with limited resources and a town terrified, the early strategy pivoted to highways and strangers. It was sensible. It may also have been the first mistake. By 2005, Elena and Roberto learned the grammar of public pleas. They sat under studio lights in Flagstaff, Elena's hands trembling, Roberto's voice sanded down by lack of sleep, and they asked for what they'd asked for 100 times in private: to please call if you know anything, even a small thing. Tips do what tips do. They arrive hot and cool quickly. A woman in Tucson thought she saw Mia in a grocery aisle. A man in Phoenix said a waitress at a diner had her same eyes. In 2010, those sightings became a cruel rhythm: hope, drive, confirm, collapse. At home, Mia's room remained untouched: neatly folded bedding, a brown diary with a nursing school dream doodled into margins, summer dresses waiting for a season that never returned. Visitors stood in her doorway and realized how heavy silence can be. By 2020, time had left its fingerprints on the Torres family. Roberto's hair went white. Elena's gaze stayed on the window even when nothing was moving. The sheriff's office classified the case what it had long been in practice: a cold case, to be reopened only if new evidence surfaced. In Red Valley, the story settled into the spaces where gossip usually lives, except this wasn't gossip. Children grew up hearing about Mia the way other kids hear about cautionary tales. Adults lowered voices when her name came up, as if volume could bruise it further. Through it all, the porch light at the Torres home burned. A vigil, a signal, a promise, and maybe a refusal to let the dark have the last word. Looking back at those early days with the benefit of hindsight is easy and unfair, but there are facts worth holding. A single sandal by a canal, a faint tire arc in dust, a missing truck, a town that searched hard and still couldn't find her. There are also small truths that don't fit neatly into a report. That night had the crackling feel of summer. Windows open, televisions low, neighbors on porches. If a truck hit water, someone should have heard a splash. No one did. If Mia left the party determined to go straight home, she had no reason to detour. And in small places, the person who knows your routines sometimes knows where to intersect them. These are not conclusions. They are the first threads you press between your fingers before you start to pull. 2 decades would pass before the desert gave anything back. But on that first night, a mother rolled a strand of hair around her finger and watched a quiet road. A father stood under a porch light and searched the same patch of horizon he'd searched 1,000 times since. And somewhere out past the edge of town, where canal banks turned the color of rust at dawn, the truth settled into mud and silence, waiting for a hand to find it. By dawn on the second day, Red Valley had the look of a town between heartbeats. Patrol cruisers idled at intersections that rarely saw a stoplight glow red, their light bars quiet like closed eyes. Deputies in sun-bleached uniforms trudged canal banks with the patience of people who know that the ground never gives up a secret in one go. The sheriff's command post, a ring of folding tables under an easy-up tent, sprouted on a graded lot behind a feed store. There, a whiteboard filled with places crossed off and names underlined. The search grid, drawn in marker, smudged by sweaty hands, spread outward from 3 anchors: the party house, the Torres home, and the irrigation canal where a white woman's sandal lay like an accusation on packed dirt. The sandal became Exhibit A in the town's private trial of what might have happened. To Elena, it was far simpler and far worse. Her daughter had worn something like that. To the deputies, it was a clue that had to be treated like a glass ornament. Bagged, logged, the location measured to the fence post, the angle of the strap recorded in photographs under ruler and scale, because in court, even a scuff must have coordinates. Helicopters, the cheapest kind of miracle, chopped low over cottonwoods and pivoted in tight circles when something in the water flashed back. Divers in black wetsuits eased into what the desert called water and the rest of Arizona called a green, slow stink. They descended by touch, hands sweeping along a canal bed gone blind with silt, fingertips searching for the geometry of anything man-made: a bumper edge, a mirror, the squared-off corner of a toolbox. On shore, handlers walked German shepherds whose paws didn't like cactus spines and whose noses didn't care. They nosed along the canal berms, pausing in ways that made everyone else pause too. When they sat ears forward, a deputy flipped up the notebook and wrote a star next to a grid square. Heat hammered down anyway. By midweek, the volunteers looked like a sunburned army. Church mothers carried cases of water that beaded with sweat before you could pop them open. High school kids stapled flyers in rings so dense that every telephone pole felt like a shrine. The missing poster, Mia Torres, 19, last seen July 12, was in English and Spanish in pencil on diner corkboards, in careful block letters taped to the windows of trucks that passed on the highway. Nobody in Red Valley was a stranger to the kind of sorrow that wears denim and keeps its head down. But vanishing is a different magnitude. It leaves the dinner table set for someone who may already be gone. It teaches the mind to replay every moment that could have been done another way. The community did what communities do. They showed up in sweat, in boots, and prayer. Inside the sheriff's office, the tone was different. Fluorescents humming, styrofoam coffee, a printer that coughed like an old man. Investigators took the Friday night timeline and tried to iron its wrinkles flat. You start with the objective things. Party starts at 8, cake at 10, music louder at 10:30. Someone said the cops might come, so they lowered the bass. Mia hugged a friend on the driveway, glanced at her borrowed keys, said something about getting home before her mother called. A neighbor's baby cried at 11:07 p.m. Was that the moment the truck door shut? People swore to times and then doubted themselves. A young man finally admitted he had been drunk and had no business trying to be a witness to anything except his own bad dancing. Another remembered seeing Mia near the fence talking to a man, then apologized when pressed. He couldn't conjure the face again without painting in features he'd picked up from gossip. Memory is a witness you never put on the stand without expecting her to falter. The list of persons of interest, always more elastic than suspects, reflected a familiar process. Daniel Ortiz, the ex, had the misfortune of being both angry in public 3 weeks before and male. You don't ignore that. Detectives pulled his time card and copied the gas station tapes. They noted the rhythm of his shift, the lull between midnight and 2, the bathroom breaks, the moments he stepped out of frame. They measured the miles between the station and the party. But the math didn't lie. The camera caught him behind the counter when Mia walked off that lawn. He had a temper, not a time machine. The older grocery coworker who'd hovered near Mia's register became a thread worth tugging too. He had called in sick that week, then later recanted the sick part, said he'd been home watching the Diamondbacks and lost track of time. Detectives took a drive down his street at night, counted the porch lights, the clear lines of sight, the places a truck would have to idle to vanish. They collected trash to see if people throw away the things they shouldn't. He looked like a man with boundary issues, not blood on his hands. Still, no one got crossed off. In absent body cases, you don't erase names. You faint them and underline them again later if something nudges your gut. Out on the canal, the scuffed crescent of a tire in dust was measured and photographed. A reconstruction specialist drove out with aluminum angle irons and chalk and a sunburn that worried his wife. He traced a possible path of a vehicle veering, stopping, turning back. But by the time his boots were on the ground, searchers' footprints had worried the soft crust into an indecipherable braid, and a morning wind had gifted the berm a new skin. In more forgiving soil, the mark might have been a ridge of frozen truth. In Red Valley, it was a suggestion. The search expanded, then contracted when the hours grew longer than the dharma of volunteers. The command post whiteboard accumulated tick marks and then fat X's. When the day's map lost its clean edges, the sheriff's captain didn't say the word futile, but everyone heard its echo. What the public didn't see were the parallel efforts that never make the evening news. DMV queries for red pickups that matched the cousin's VIN. Insurance cross-checks for vehicles unexpectedly dropped from policies that summer. Banks checked for any card swipes that could indicate Mia wasn't the one in control of her own account. Detectives phoned scrapyards within 3 counties, listening for the telltale hesitation from a clerk who'd taken cash for something not logged. The county requested satellite images, grainy, broad-stroked, more hope than science. In 2001, materials analysis and digital forensics were sturdy but not nimble. Genealogical DNA existed mostly in the imagination of future conferences. The case lived on calls and handshakes, on legal pads and ticked boxes, on the willingness of an investigator to knock on a door twice because the first time felt wrong. By week's end, Red Valley's unity began to strain under the weight of not knowing. The market's coffee counter turned into a chorus of amateur profilers. Some insisted a stranger had taken her. The highway was right there, after all. Others, shaking their heads with the certainty of people who've lived here long enough to know what's in everyone's pantries, said no. It had to be someone who knew her. Her route was 10 minutes, a farmer muttered, tracing the air with a finger. 10 minutes is nothing unless you plan to make it longer. Mothers began walking their daughters to cars, standing in driveways until taillights became constellations on the county road. Men who'd known one another since Little League gave each other the barest nods and looked away. Fear is a solvent. It eats at the glue that keeps small towns held together. The sheriff's office took heat from Phoenix Talk Radio and polite skepticism from local clergy who had parishioners' grief to manage. Did you search the canals thoroughly? The answer was yes, and also not enough. The desert hoards what it can. Did you canvass the neighborhood twice? Of course. Did you ask the hard questions of the people who brought casseroles to the Torres porch? That one was delicate. Publicly, the department urged patience. Privately, a sergeant told his squad the truth that makes investigators lose sleep. When you can't find the scene is still out there, and the person who owns that scene might be walking past us carrying paper cups of coffee. On the 7th day, the search didn't end so much as shift shape. The volunteers thinned. The whiteboard maps got fewer new marks. The case file got thicker. The poster stayed taped to the church doorway, curling at the edges. The Torres home learned a new routine. Calls in the morning that led nowhere by lunch. A knock in the afternoon that turned out to be someone with the best intentions and the wrong intuition. The evening silence broken by Elena stepping onto the porch and touching the light switch as if she could, by sheer insistence, make it a lighthouse rather than a porch bulb. Roberto cleaned the red dust from Mia's dresser with a folded t-shirt that still carried her scent. He fixed a sticky cabinet door because he could fix a door and not the only thing that mattered. If there was a psychology to the unknown person who did this, an investigator said the word unknown with the intentionality of people reminding themselves not to assume, it likely lived in the intersection of comfort and control. Offenders who operate close to home often manipulate routes the victim trusts, last-minute detours justified by neighborly lies, help with a truck, a quick ride, a question about church. The red pickup wasn't just a vehicle, it was a promise of safety. Her cousins, familiar, keys in her own hand, home minutes away. For the person who took that promise, the canals and the farm roads offered privacy without needing to be clever, and privacy is often all cruelty requires. When the sheriff's office finally had to use the phrase "no new leads," it landed with the thud of bad furniture. The press swallowed it and moved on to fires and budget hearings. But the quiet didn't mean nothing was happening. Detectives kept the file close and the list long. They kept notes on the men who inserted themselves a little too eagerly into the search, who lingered on the Torres porch, who spoke about Mia in the past tense before anyone should. They learned the hard lesson all seasoned cops know. Killers don't always flee the scene. Sometimes they park their grief beside the families and learn the investigation's shape by watching it unfold. Red Valley, meanwhile, learned to live with the pause. The porch light glowed. The canal slid by, green and patient. Somewhere, out of sight, the evidence settled into mud and waited for a storm with the right appetite. And in the space between what was done and what must be done, a community kept walking forward in the heat, squinting against a horizon that refused to answer back. By autumn of 2001, the name Mia Torres had already begun its drift from newsprint into whispers. Newspapers in Phoenix moved on to politics and wildfires. Local reporters checked in less often, their camera crews dwindling to one-man bands who could shoot, interview, and edit in the same exhausted afternoon. But inside Red Valley, the case didn't vanish. It burrowed. It lived in the way neighbors glanced at one another across grocery aisles, in the empty space at the church's youth group table, in the quiet tug at a mother's hand when her daughter asked if she could walk alone to the market. Fear that doesn't resolve itself becomes ritual. For the Torres family, that ritual meant keeping Mia's room frozen, bedspread smoothed, diary closed to the last written page, a closet still fragrant with her perfume. For the town, it meant circling every July back to the church, candles in hand, the memory of a girl's smile carried like a hymn. The sheriff's office faced a problem that homicide investigators everywhere know. Without a body, the case refuses to stand still. Leads degrade not just in usefulness, but in credibility. Witnesses convince themselves they saw things they did not, or forget the things they did. Rumors inflate until they are as solid as facts. Law enforcement must chase them anyway, knowing the pursuit is often a cul-de-sac. Detectives questioned relatives again. The cousin who had lent Mia the truck, the uncle she sometimes visited in Flagstaff, even an aunt who admitted she never liked Daniel Ortiz, as if suspicion could transfer by marriage. Hours of interviews yielded nothing sharper than family pain. Investigators kept case binders thick with notes, but the spine of the file had no anchor event, no crash, no discovery, no remains. It was a story of absence, which is the hardest kind to tell in a courtroom. In those early years, the community's theory-making filled the vacuum. Some swore a stranger passing through had snatched her, pointing at the highway that runs like an artery past town. Others leaned towards someone local, someone who knew her well enough to catch her off guard, someone who had noticed that Mia rarely refused to help. The latter group whispered names, sometimes Ortiz, sometimes the older coworker, sometimes even a family acquaintance. Theories spread in barbershops and over football bleachers, morphing each time like folk tales. Investigators monitored the gossip as carefully as any physical evidence, because in small towns, killers sometimes let their conscience leak out sideways through rumor. Still, nothing concrete surfaced. Red Valley became a place with two maps, the official one with canals and county roads, and the unofficial one in people's heads, marked by suspicions and shadows. By 2005, the Torres parents sat across from TV anchors under hot lights, the mother's hands trembling in her lap, the father's jaw locked tight. They asked the same thing they had asked 100 times, for anyone who knew anything, however small, to come forward. And tips did arrive, brief, flickering. A woman in Tucson swore she had seen Mia waiting at a bus stop. A man in Phoenix said a waitress looked just like her. Detectives ran down each claim with the grim professionalism that knows hope can sometimes look foolish. Every lead collapsed into error. A mistaken resemblance, a blurred photo, a woman with the same brown eyes but a different life entirely. Each collapse broke the Torres family anew, the cycle of hope and despair grinding like gears against their health. Elena's voice, once urgent, grew quieter. Roberto's shoulders bent as though the years themselves had weight. What the public rarely saw was the toll inside the sheriff's department. Detectives knew the likelihood curve on missing girls in their teens, By the time a week has passed, the chance she is alive narrows to a hair's breadth. By the time years roll in, the work becomes archaeology of behavior rather than rescue. Still, investigators don't close cases easily. They stored Mia's hairbrush, the scrap of stained fabric, the single white sandal, preserved under the evidence protocols of the early 2000s. Back then, DNA analysis existed, but it lacked the precision and reach of modern databases. Samples too small to sequence were boxed anyway, labeled with the hope that future science might turn them into testimony. It is an act of faith, in its way, bagging an item you cannot yet use, trusting that someday someone will. Meanwhile, the Torres family's vigil became a landmark in Red Valley. Every July 12th, candles lined the church steps, fewer each year, but always enough to glow. Alina polished her daughter's photo frame until it gleamed. Roberto bowed his head over folded hands. To outsiders, it looked like a small ceremony. To those who lived there, it was the annual heartbeat of the town's grief. Children born after 2001 grew up hearing the story not as news but as legend. The girl who vanished, the truck that disappeared, the porch light that never went dark. They whispered her name like a ghost tale at sleepovers, but the adults knew better. It wasn't haunting. It was history, unsolved and unfinished. By 2010, the case file wore the official label of a cold case. It sat in storage among others, dust on its edge, waiting for something new. And still, rumors persisted. A few swore they had seen her alive in bigger cities, working under another name. Others insisted the desert held her, that the canals had swallowed truck and girl both. Forensic experts years later would confirm what investigators suspected all along. Vehicles can settle invisibly under desert silt, unreachable to sonar, invisible to helicopters. Their outlines softened until they are indistinguishable from the earth itself. But at the time, it felt like magic, dark, cruel magic, that a red pickup could simply cease to exist. The psychology of the suspect, whoever he was, began to take on shape in the investigators' minds. Theories hardened. It had to be someone comfortable in the terrain, someone who could move a vehicle off the main route without raising suspicion, someone who blended enough to escape a small town's relentless gaze. The idea that the killer might have been among the volunteers was discussed in low tones, an unsettling possibility. Predators often insert themselves into searches. They light candles, they knock on doors, they even hold hands with grieving parents. Not because they care, but because proximity offers camouflage. It was a theory the sheriff's team didn't publicize. Not then. But it lingered in the file notes, a faint warning in ink. Through the 2010s, the Torres family endured a cruel rhythm of false hope. A tip here, a reported sighting there, each leading to disappointment. By 2015, Elena admitted on camera that she sometimes wished the calls would stop, that the hope was more painful than silence. Roberto, his hair now white, still cleaned his daughter's room weekly, dusting books and smoothing the stuffed animals on her bed. Their small home became a museum of waiting. Visitors stood in her doorway and felt the weight of a life paused mid-sentence. By 2020, the case was officially shelved. Red Valley moved forward on the surface. New elections, new stores, new children, but the absence remained like an unhealed scar. The porch light at the Torres house still burned. To some, it was a symbol of hope. To others, a ghost light. But to Elena and Roberto, it was simply the only way they knew to keep their daughter's memory alive. The worst part, Elena told a reporter once, wasn't losing Mia. It was not knowing. That, she said, is a torment that never sleeps. And then, after nearly 2 decades of silence, nature intervened. In March 2022, rare heavy rains hammered Red Valley. For 2 days, the desert drank more than it had in years. The canals, usually sluggish with green water or bone dry in drought, surged and then drained, scouring their own beds. On the 3rd morning, a farmer named Miguel Hernandez drove his truck out to check erosion. At a bend 3 miles from town, he saw metal pushing through mud, red paint ghosting through black silt. He thought it was an old plow blade. He scraped at it with his sleeve, and then he froze. It was the front of a truck. Miguel Hernandez would later tell reporters that when his hand brushed against the rusted metal, time itself seemed to hesitate. He had been prepared for farm debris, scrap iron, an abandoned gate, but the faded crimson beneath the grime triggered something different, something he'd carried silently for 2 decades. red paint, and in Red Valley that color belonged to only one missing thing. His breath caught, his stomach dropped. Mia Torres. He stepped back, hands trembling, staring at the half-buried shape until his truck's engine sputtered and reminded him the world was still turning. Miguel fumbled for his phone, called the sheriff, and in a voice gone thin with shock, reported what he had found. Within an hour, yellow tape cut across the dirt road. The canal bank swarmed with uniforms, their boots sinking into wet mud, radios crackling sharp against the quiet desert morning. The salvage crew arrived with chains, cranes, and patience. Townsfolk gathered behind temporary barriers, their whispers louder than the wind. They watched as men in neon vests hooked steel to the hidden machine and winched it upward. The mud did not give willingly. Metal shrieked as if the earth itself objected to giving up its secret. Inch by inch, the red pickup emerged, a warped skeleton of steel and rust, its body clinging to decades of silt and silence. People held their breath. Some crossed themselves. Some turned away. When the door was pried open, what lay inside silenced even the deputies hardened by years of desert crime. The skeletal remains of a young woman folded in the driver's seat, bones twisted, hair still clinging in dark strands to the headrest. In the footwell, a leather wallet, bloated with water damage, gave up the last piece of its identity, a faded ID card bearing the name Mia Torres. For 2 decades, she had been beneath their feet. The discovery was both an answer and an accusation. Red Valley hadn't been haunted by absence. It had been haunted by presence, hidden in plain mud, waiting to be seen. News traveled faster than any siren. By noon, the story hit Phoenix and Tucson, broadcast with grainy photos of the rusted pickup lifted against the pale desert sky. Neighbors filled the roadside, some clutching each other, others whispering prayers. Elena and Roberto were escorted to the sheriff's office before word reached them secondhand. When told, Elena collapsed against a deputy's chest, wailing words no language can carry. Roberto sat silent, hands gripping his knees, staring through the floor as if he might see the canal itself. For them, the nightmare was not over. It had only changed shape. They had lost hope of Mia being alive years before, but now the grief became real, rooted in bones and steel. They finally had their daughter back, but not in the way they had begged heaven for. With the truck came a second chance at justice. The sheriff's office immediately called in the state's cold case unit, a team built for the kind of evidence archaeology that 20 years of dust and time demand. They assembled at Phoenix headquarters, where a whiteboard bore bold letters, Torres Case, Red Valley, 2001. At the head of the team stood Detective Elena Ramirez, a seasoned investigator in her 40s, known statewide for patience sharper than any interrogator's aggression. She understood what it meant to grow up in overlooked neighborhoods, to see cases dropped when the victims belonged to immigrant families, to hear the silence of justice delayed. For her, this was not just another assignment, it was a reckoning. Her team was diverse by design. Mark Sullivan, a 30-year veteran with a memory that made him a human archive. Dr. Priya Desai, a forensic scientist whose skill at retesting old evidence often resurrected cases left for dead. Aaron Miller, a young DNA specialist fluent in the new genealogical databases unavailable in 2001, and junior officers tasked with combing through the yellowed files of the original investigation. They weren't chasing ghosts. They were chasing the truth buried beneath 21 years of error, oversight, and silence. At the first briefing, Ramirez held up the thick file, its edges softened from use, and told her team, "We are not just finding who killed Mia Torres. We are answering for Red Valley, for why her justice was buried for 21 years. The room was still. Each detective knew the weight of those words. They weren't simply solving a murder. They were repairing the credibility of the system that had failed a family and a town. The re-examination began with old evidence. Priya Desai took custody of the sandal, the scrap of fabric, and the hairbrush. With technology 2 decades more advanced, she could extract DNA from even microscopic traces, build profiles from fragments the 2001 lab had dismissed as too degraded. Aaron Miller connected the case to CODIS and the new genealogical networks, systems powerful enough to turn a drop of blood into a family tree. Mark Sullivan revisited witness statements, comparing contradictions, noting which memories had shifted with time. and Ramirez herself pored over the original investigative choices, questioning why the canals hadn't been prioritized, why the absence of a truck had been treated as evidence of flight rather than concealment. Each page carried not just data, but the shadow of mistakes. The red pickup, though, became the centerpiece. Once drained, photographed, and hauled into an evidence bay, it revealed more than rust. Under UV light, stains bloomed along the upholstery, dried blood, dark and stubborn, a broken silver chain with a heart-shaped pendant, its engraving faint but legible, the letter M. And along the canal bank, engineers studied the skid marks fossilized into hardened earth. They weren't smooth arcs of a driver losing control. They were jagged, abrupt, suggesting force, perhaps another vehicle pushing, perhaps deliberate violence disguised as accident. For Ramirez, the conclusion was unavoidable. Mia's death had never been an accident. The truck hadn't slid. It had been forced. This realization reframed everything. If the truck had been deliberately driven or pushed into the canal, then Mia had been silenced by design, and the absence of witnesses that summer night, the lack of anyone hearing the splash, no longer seemed like coincidence. Perhaps the timing was chosen precisely because the canals, though near homes, ran through fields where machinery and irrigation pumps masked sound. Perhaps the perpetrator had known the landscape intimately, and perhaps he had been close enough to Mia to guide her there without raising suspicion. As Ramirez sketched a red line on a map tracing Mia's direct route home, she circled the canal. She had no reason to be here, she told her team. So either someone forced her or someone else drove this truck. The room fell into a tense silence. Two possibilities, both grim. One meant Mia had fought for her life. The other meant she had already been gone before her truck ever hit the water. When the sun set over Phoenix that night, the whiteboard in the cold case room looked different. New photographs pinned in rows, the rusted truck, the necklace, the bloodstains glowing under blue light. Notes in red marker. Accident? No. Force, timeline, suspects. Ramirez stayed longest, staring at Mia's graduation photo taped in the corner. A young woman with dreams of nursing school, forever 19. Ramirez whispered, barely audible even to herself, "We hear you now, Mia. We won't let this go again." The hunt for truth had begun anew, 21 years late, but not too late. And in Red Valley, a community long dulled by silence braced itself. The storm had finally arrived, and with it the chance for justice. The weeks after the truck's recovery blurred into a kind of controlled frenzy. The Arizona State Forensics Lab worked day and night, handling every scrap with the care usually reserved for ancient relics. To Elena Ramirez, that's exactly what these were, not just evidence, but artifacts of a stolen life. She stood behind glass as technicians cataloged each item, gloves and masks muting their humanity. Every bone from the driver's seat was tagged, bagged, and gently lifted into trays. DNA swabs were taken from teeth, femurs, even the smallest fragments, because after 2 decades submerged, any detail could be the difference between silence and truth. The first confirmation came quickly, but hit with the weight of finality. A DNA comparison between the remains and Mia's preserved hairbrush confirmed what everyone suspected, but few were ready to hear aloud. The body was Mia Torres. Her parents wept when told, Roberto gripping Elena's hand until both their knuckles turned white. For them, the words were a cruel paradox. Closure that didn't close anything. A final answer that opened only deeper pain. The girl they had waited for had been with them all along, hidden in a canal's muddy bend. But the lab's findings didn't stop at Mia. When technicians swabbed the truck's floor and passenger seat, a different genetic signature surfaced, traces of male blood, faint but intact enough for a full profile. It was a whisper, a ghost of a struggle, but in the language of forensics it was louder than any eyewitness. Ramirez watched as the DNA was fed into CODIS, the national database. She had seen this moment before in other cases, the hush in the room, the scrolling bars on the monitor, the long seconds that felt like hours. Then a match. A name appeared. David Harper. The team froze. Harper wasn't a stranger, wasn't a drifter passing through. He had been a neighbor in 2001, just a few houses down from the Torres family. 26 years old then, working as a mechanic at a local garage. His DNA had entered CODIS after a minor bar fight in 2009, a sample forgotten in an old file until now. And here it was, perfectly matching the blood in Mia's truck. Sullivan, the veteran investigator, set down his pen slowly. He remembered Harper, remembered his face at prayer vigils, his presence in search parties, the mechanic who brought coffee to volunteers, who stood beside Mia's parents holding candles. Ramirez's words from their first meeting echoed back. Sometimes the killer hides in the crowd. The discovery jolted the investigation into a new phase. Photos from 2001 surfaced showing Harper shoulder to shoulder with Elena and Roberto, his expression solemn, his hands clasped around a candle. To the town, he had been the good guy, the friendly neighbor who fixed cars without charging, who carried boxes for old ladies after church. No one had suspected him, and perhaps that was exactly why he had gone unnoticed. For predators, invisibility often comes dressed as kindness. Still, Ramirez knew DNA alone wouldn't be enough. It placed Harper in the truck, but defense attorneys could argue contamination, proximity, even innocent explanation. Neighbors share spaces, tools, meals. To charge him with murder, the case needed narrative, motive, opportunity, pattern. The team dug into Harper's past with the meticulousness of archaeologists. Witness interviews from 2001 were reread, and suddenly details once overlooked took on new meaning. A partygoer had mentioned Mia talking to a man near the parking lot before leaving, but couldn't recall his face. Now, with Harper's name on the table, that shadow filled in. A grocery store coworker remembered Harper hanging around too often, making offhand comments about Mia's looks dismissed then as harmless jokes. Another woman, older now, came forward with a memory of being followed home by Harper as a teen. Her parents had brushed it aside at the time, insisting David was trustworthy. These recollections weren't just coincidences. They outlined a pattern, a man whose helpful exterior masked predatory interest. What once looked like idle neighborly chatter now read as grooming, boundary testing, opportunism. Ramirez wrote on the board, access, obsession, opportunity, 3 pillars of a suspect profile. She reminded the team that killers of this type often embed themselves in the lives of their victims, normalizing their presence until the final act of violence seems in hindsight like the only thing left unseen. Back in Red Valley, news of the DNA match spread like wildfire. Local headlines screamed the betrayal, neighbor who helped search now prime suspect. The town split down the middle. Older residents defended Harper fiercely, pointing to every tire he'd patched, every favor he'd done without asking payment. Others, particularly women who remembered his stares or jokes, felt vindicated. Finally, someone else was listening. Social media amplified the division, former classmates posting memories of Harper's friendliness alongside stories of unease. The man once painted as Red Valley's kind mechanic was suddenly recast as its possible predator. Ramirez and her team watched the discourse carefully, noting how suppressed memories bubbled to the surface once people felt safe to speak. It's common in cold cases. When the dam breaks, the water carries everything. Truths, exaggerations, long-buried pain. But beneath the noise, the portrait of David Harper sharpened. He wasn't just nearby that night. He had motive, opportunity, and history. Now the task was to stitch those threads into a case strong enough to stand in a courtroom. Late one evening, as files stacked higher and the whiteboard filled with timelines, Ramirez lingered alone. Mia's graduation photo stared back from the corner. She thought of the porch light, burning all those years in Red Valley. A beacon of hope, yes, but also a reminder of failure. She whispered to the photograph, a promise carried only by the hum of fluorescent bulbs. We've heard you, Mia, and we're not stopping until your story is told. The stage was set. The evidence was mounting. And for the first time in 21 years, the name David Harper was no longer synonymous with kindness. It was synonymous with suspicion, with betrayal, with a darkness hidden in plain sight. The morning of David Harper's arrest began before sunrise. A chill mist clung to the desert town, unusual for Red Valley, and the quiet streets lay under a faint gray veil. At 5 a.m., the stillness shattered. Police cruisers rolled silently into Harper's block, headlights off until they parked nose to nose across the street. Then came the flash of red and blue strobes, the bark of a megaphone. Police! Open the door! The neighborhood woke in an instant. Curtains twitched. Porch lights snapped on. Children clung to mothers' robes. The sleepy mechanic everyone thought they knew was now the target of the loudest knock in town history. Harper appeared in the doorway in gray pajamas, his hair tangled, eyes shadowed. For a moment, he froze, his expression flat, almost detached, before 3 deputies moved in. The words echoed down the street. "David Harper, you are under arrest for the murder of Mia Torres." The handcuffs clicked with finality. Harper didn't resist, didn't protest. He only scanned the gathered neighbors with a blank, unnerving stare. Some gasped, others cried out. A longtime neighbor, Mrs. Diaz, trembled against her porch post, whispering, "Not David, not him." A teenager muttered into his phone camera, "I'm posting this. Everyone's gonna see." The footage would spread across Arizona within hours. A small town's nightmare broadcast in pixels. At the county sheriff's press conference later that morning, Detective Ramirez stood before the microphones. Her voice was steady, her face carved from resolve. "We have arrested David Harper, 47 of Red Valley, and charged him with the murder of Mia Torres. DNA evidence from the recovered pickup confirms his involvement. This is a major step toward justice in a case that has haunted this community for 21 years." Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Ramirez said no more. She knew the evidence would speak louder than any press statement. The Torres family received the news in silence that was anything but empty. Elena collapsed against Roberto's chest, sobbing so violently her body shook. Roberto sat stiff in his chair, gripping the remote with such force it creaked. 21 years of waiting had ended in a single name. But instead of relief, the revelation opened a deeper wound. The man accused wasn't a stranger on the highway. He was their neighbor, the man who had fixed their truck, shared their dinners, bowed his head at vigils. Betrayal cuts sharper when it comes wrapped in trust. Elena whispered, half to herself, "He was in our home, and we never saw it." Roberto walked to the porch and stared at the light still burning, muttering, "If only I had known. If only I had stopped him." It was a grief twisted with guilt, though neither bore any fault. Memories turned sour overnight. Roberto recalled winter of 2000, when his old pickup failed outside the Red Valley market. Harper had appeared, smiling, sleeves rolled up, and had it running in half an hour. They had thanked him with dinner. Elena's enchiladas, Mia chatting about school across the table, Harper laughing warmly as if he belonged. That memory, once cherished as neighborly kindness, now curdled into poison. Elena remembered the small gifts Harper brought, the tools he borrowed, the way his gaze lingered a second too long on her daughter. All of it, in hindsight, felt like warning signs ignored. "He was right there in front of us," she whispered, "and we didn't see." The town's reaction was equally fractured. At the cafe, some swore Harper had been framed, pointing to his decades of good deeds. Others slammed their fists on tables, insisting they had always found him off. Women began speaking up about encounters they had buried for years. The grocery co-worker who described Harper's inappropriate jokes, a woman who admitted he had once followed her home as a teenager. Back then, their complaints had been brushed aside. "That's just David. He's harmless." Now those memories painted a chilling pattern. On social media, childhood friends posted defenses while others countered with their own stories of unease. The mask of the good neighbor was cracking, and beneath it was a face few wanted to recognize. Ramirez and her team monitored all of it, carefully separating rumor from relevance. But she understood the psychological reality. The arrest had not just implicated Harper. It had forced the entire town to question its own blindness. How had they let him stand among them, light candles with them, search beside them? It was a question that would haunt Red Valley as much as the crime itself. That evening, back at the Torres home, Elena lit a candle beneath her daughter's photo. The flame flickered, illuminating Mia's young smile, frozen forever. "My girl," she whispered, voice cracking, "we finally know, but I wish that man had never crossed our doorstep." Roberto placed a hand on her shoulder. They both understood. The arrest was not the end, but the beginning of a harder road. Trials, testimony, reliving wounds before strangers in a courtroom. Yet for the first time in 21 years, they were no longer lost in fog. They had a name, a face, and a chance at justice. For Red Valley, the betrayal was personal. The monster wasn't a shadow on the highway. He had been in their kitchens, their garages, their churches. And as Harper sat in a holding cell that night, staring at gray walls with the same blank calm he had shown at his arrest, a town tried to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the killer. The evidence revealed. The courthouse in Coconino County had not seen a crowd like this in decades. On the morning of the first trial date, reporters lined up along the stone steps before sunrise, microphones angled toward the heavy wooden doors. Camera crews jostled for position, their lenses aimed at the entrance where David Harper, now clad in an orange jumpsuit and shackled at the wrists, was led inside. His face was blank, his stride measured. To some, it looked like arrogance. To others, it was simply the hollow mask of a man who refused to betray any emotion. Behind him, deputies walked with grim determination, their presence both protection and warning. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was taut with expectation. The benches groaned under the weight of Red Valley residents who had driven miles to witness the reckoning. The Torres family sat in the front row. Elena's hands clutched a small framed photo of Mia, her knuckles white, tears already threatening. Roberto, silent as always, held her free hand with a grip so tight it trembled. They weren't just parents attending a trial. They were the living reminder of what was lost, the human anchor tethering this case to flesh and blood. The prosecutor, a tall man with sharp diction, began with stark clarity. He projected photos onto the screen. The rusted red pickup dragged from the canal, the broken necklace with the letter M, the blood-stained fabric. This is the voice of truth, he declared. This is the evidence that speaks for Mia Torres, who can no longer speak for herself. And it tells us that David Harper was with her that night, that he left his blood inside her truck, that he forced her from her path home and into a canal where she remained for 21 years. His words reverberated through the room, stirring whispers and muffled gasps before the judge's gavel restored order. Then came the defense, measured, calculated. Harper's attorney, a seasoned man with silver hair and an air of calm, stood with hands clasped behind his back. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the jury directly, "DNA is powerful, but DNA is not infallible. It proves presence, not intent. My client lived in Red Valley. He knew the Torres family. He shared meals with them. He helped fix their truck. A trace of his blood in Mia's pickup could have come from an innocent encounter weeks or even months before that night. There is no eyewitness. There is no confession. And in the American justice system, guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt." His tone was firm, but not aggressive, as if he hoped to plant quiet seeds of hesitation in the minds of jurors. The courtroom split down invisible lines. Some jurors shifted uneasily. Others stared hard at Harper, as if willing him to betray guilt with a twitch or a sigh. Meanwhile, the prosecution pushed forward with testimony that attempted to peel away Harper's carefully constructed facade. Women who had once stayed silent stepped onto the stand, their voices trembling but resolute. A former co-worker described his lingering presence near Mia's register, the way his jokes sometimes crossed into something darker. Another, now in her 30s, recounted being followed home as a teenager, her protest brushed off by adults who had insisted Harper was harmless. The prosecutor wove these accounts into a pattern of predatory behavior, a man who wore kindness as camouflage. The defense countered at every turn. No reports were filed at the time, the attorney emphasized. No records exist. Memories fade, especially after 20 years. These are not facts. They are stories, distorted by fear and hindsight. He reminded the jury that Harper had never been arrested for violent crime, that he had lived in Red Valley openly for years without incident. He gestured toward the benches where some neighbors sat, arms crossed, faces conflicted. "This is a man you knew, a man who fixed your tractors, who lit candles at vigils. Does that sound like a killer who hides in plain sight for 2 decades? His voice was steady, almost hypnotic. Doubt, he knew, was his only weapon. Through it all, Harper remained a stone. He sat straight-backed at the defense table, eyes forward, showing neither anger nor remorse. His stillness unsettled many in the gallery. Roberto stared at him with a gaze sharp enough to cut, silently demanding an answer to the question that would never leave him. Why? Elena, unable to bear looking at Harper's face, fixed her eyes instead on her daughter's photo, whispering prayers under her breath. For the townspeople packed into the back rows, the trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a mirror. Some still clung to the memory of the man they once trusted, unwilling to reconcile the mechanic who shared dinners and prayers with the predator described in court. Others, especially women, saw validation in every new revelation, proof that their discomfort all those years ago had not been paranoia, but warning. The divide ran deep, conversations spilling from the courtroom into the coffee shop, the market, even Sunday sermons. Red Valley was not just on trial, its very sense of community, trust, and memory was. The judge's gavel struck at the end of the first day, his warning echoing through the hushed chamber. This case is tied to a community's grief, but remember it will be decided on evidence and law alone. Cameras flashed as Harper was escorted out, still blank, still unshaken. The Torres family stood slowly, clinging to each other for balance. They had waited 21 years for this moment, and though the road ahead promised more pain, they finally stood in the room where truth might be spoken aloud. Outside, the desert sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of red that looked eerily like blood on stone. For the first time in decades, Red Valley did not whisper Mia Torres' name in secret. They spoke it openly, in court, in news headlines, on the lips of neighbors and strangers alike. And in that speaking, the silence that had cloaked her story for so long began at last to fracture. The trial pressed forward with a relentless rhythm, each day peeling back layers of Red Valley's carefully constructed silence. Evidence technicians took the stand, walking jurors through the painstaking recovery of the red pickup. Enlarged photographs showed rusted metal, the necklace with the broken chain, the blood-stained upholstery under ultraviolet light. The forensic scientist, Dr. Priya Desai, explained how modern technology could read genetic whispers that once would have been invisible. She detailed how Mia's DNA and Harper's DNA coexisted in the same enclosed space, their profiles intersecting like two voices caught on one recording. This isn't speculation, she told the jury. It is scientific fact. David Harper was inside that truck the night Mia Torres vanished. Her words rang like a bell. Some jurors leaned forward. Others shifted uncomfortably under the weight of certainty. The defense, steady and unflinching, struck back. They called their own expert, a forensic consultant who emphasized that DNA transfer could occur innocently, especially among neighbors. He raised the specter of contamination, of mishandled evidence from the original 2001 investigation. 2 decades is a long time, he reminded the jury. What you see here is not a fresh crime scene, but one altered by time, weather, and human error. Reasonable doubt lives in that 21-year gap. His testimony planted shadows, subtle but deliberate, hoping to blur the clarity the prosecution had tried so hard to draw. Outside the courtroom, the town wrestled with its conscience. Local diners buzzed with arguments. Some, particularly older men who had once shared beers with Harper or brought him their tractors to repair, refused to believe the image of the friendly mechanic could dissolve into that of a killer. Others, especially women who now found courage in numbers, spoke openly of their unease with him, recounting stares, comments, encounters they had long buried. The divide deepened between those who clung to the past they thought they knew and those who felt betrayed that warnings had gone unheeded for so long. In Red Valley, trust was no longer currency. It was suspicion. For Elena and Roberto, each day in court was another wound reopened. They listened as their daughter's final moments were reconstructed in sterile detail. They saw her sandals displayed in plastic, the diary entries she once wrote about nursing school projected on screens, fragments of her life turned into exhibits. Elena clutched tissues until they shredded in her hand. Roberto remained stone-faced, but his eyes told another story. An exhaustion that comes only from carrying grief too long. To them, the courtroom was not about legal arguments. It was about finally hearing Mia's story told aloud, her silence broken by the voices of science, witnesses, and prosecutors who had sworn to stand for her. Psychologists often testify in trials like this, not about the victim, but about the perpetrator's profile. Here, the prosecution painted Harper as a man who lived behind a mask. They spoke of his pattern of inserting himself into the family's grief, lighting candles at vigils, bringing food to the Torres home, and searching the desert fields as if he were desperate for answers. This is the behavior of someone hiding in plain sight, the prosecutor argued. Predators often mask their guilt by placing themselves at the center of the search, making themselves indispensable, convincing a community they are incapable of the very crime they committed. The words resonated because the jury had seen the photographs. Harper, young and smiling, standing behind the Torres parents with a candle in hand. The juxtaposition was damning. The defense, unwilling to let that image harden, shifted strategy. They attempted to humanize Harper, presenting photos of him volunteering at church, testimonials from neighbors who insisted he was kind, generous, incapable of violence. They argued that the community had turned on him only after the DNA match, that memory was being reshaped by hindsight, fear, and rumor. Do not let gossip convict a man, the defense attorney implored. Do not let grief become a substitute for proof. His words struck some as manipulative, but for others in the gallery, they touched a lingering hesitation. Could they have been wrong about the man they once trusted? Through all of it, Harper sat motionless, a statue in orange. His calm unnerved many. He did not cry. He did not frown. He did not sweat under the lights. He simply sat, as if detached from the gravity of the trial. For Elena, his stillness was unbearable. She whispered to Roberto once, "Look at him. No remorse, no soul." To Roberto it was worse. He longed for Harper to break, to explain, to speak even one word of truth. Instead, silence filled the space where answers should have been. The jury listened, notebooks filling with questions. In the back of the courtroom, Red Valley residents sat shoulder to shoulder, their whispers a chorus of disbelief and conviction. Some shook their heads, muttering that Harper had fooled them all. Others crossed their arms defiantly, refusing to abandon the image of the neighbor they had trusted for years. It was no longer just a trial about one man and one young woman. It had become a trial of memory, of community, of how deeply darkness can hide in plain view. As the gavel closed another long day, cameras once again captured Harper being led away, wrists shackled, head high. Outside, the desert air was heavy with anticipation. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their microphones chasing every whisper. And in Red Valley's small houses, porch lights glowed into the night, not just at the Torres home, but across town. Symbols of solidarity, fear, and the fragile hope that, after 21 years, justice might finally speak. The trial's final days carried a gravity that pressed on everyone present. The courtroom had grown familiar with the rituals, prosecutor rising with clip precision, defense attorney countering with smooth deflections, witnesses stepping forward under oath. But the closer the case drew to its end, the more the silence between words mattered. Every pause, every glance from juror to defendant felt heavy with consequence. For Elena and Roberto Torres, each session was both agony and a vigil. They had sat in those benches so long, listening to their daughter's life dissected into evidence tags and testimonies, that the creak of the wood beneath them seemed to echo her absence. The prosecution's closing argument was sharp, deliberate, and merciless in its clarity. Photographs flashed across the screen: the rusted red truck, the necklace with the engraved M, the DNA charts that tied Mia and Harper into the same sealed space. "This is not coincidence," the prosecutor told the jury, voice rising with conviction. "This is not contamination. This is the truth left behind in blood, metal, and bone. Mia Torres was taken from this world by the man sitting before you. He hid in plain sight, wearing the mask of a helpful neighbor, while her parents lit candles for 21 years under the shadow of his betrayal. Today, you have the chance to give Mia what she was denied: justice." His words hung in the air like a sentence already pronounced. The defense countered with restraint, knowing theatrics would only deepen suspicion. The attorney's voice was calm, measured, as he reminded the jury of their duty. No eyewitness saw David Harper with Mia that night. DNA proves presence, but not murder. They shared meals, they shared tools. Innocent contact can leave traces, and 21 years is a lifetime of doubt. You cannot convict a man on shadows and assumptions. If doubt remains, you must acquit. He let the words linger, his eyes moving slowly from juror to juror, planting seeds of hesitation that might one day bloom into reasonable doubt. Harper himself remained a cipher. Through weeks of testimony, he never flinched, never broke, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. Some saw arrogance, others emptiness. But to the Torres family, his silence was unbearable. Roberto glared at him with a fury carved from 2 decades of loss, silently demanding, "Why?" Elena, too, stared, whispering under her breath prayers that justice would not falter now. Neither received acknowledgement. Harper gave nothing, as if his only defense was to deny the world any glimpse of truth. The jury deliberated for hours that stretched into days. Outside, Red Valley simmered in collective anticipation. Neighbors who had once argued in whispers now clashed openly, at the market, in the church parking lot, over coffee cups. Some insisted Harper was innocent, that the case was built on shaky science and grief's desperate need for closure. Others pointed to the undeniable, his DNA in Mia's truck, his pattern of unsettling behavior, the mask of kindness that fit too perfectly. The divide mirrored the courtroom itself, where 12 jurors bore the weight of decades. When the jury finally filed back into the chamber, every breath in the room stilled. Elena clutched Roberto's hand so tightly he winced, but did not let go. The foreperson rose, paper trembling slightly in her grasp. The judge asked the question that had hung over Red Valley for 21 years. The foreperson answered, "We, the jury, find the defendant, David Harper, guilty of murder in the first degree." The words cracked the air. Elena collapsed against Roberto's chest, sobs racking her body. Roberto closed his eyes, a single tear tracing the lines of his face. Around them, gasps, whispers, and cries erupted. Some neighbors wept in relief. Others shook their heads in disbelief, their faith in Harper shattered. And Harper himself? He did not flinch. He stood, his face as blank as when he had been arrested, as deputies moved to escort him away in chains. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Headlines blared within minutes. Justice after 21 years. Harper convicted of Mia Torres murder. Red Valley buzzed with the weight of it. Some celebrated, gathering at the church that evening to light candles in Mia's name. Others retreated into silence, unwilling to accept that the man they once called neighbor, friend, or even savior had been unmasked as a killer. But for the Torres family, the verdict was less celebration than release. Elena whispered through tears, "We kept our promise, Mia. We never gave up." Roberto stood beside her, silent but resolute, the weight of years finally shifting. Weeks later, Mia's remains were laid to rest in a small cemetery south of town. Willow trees cast long shadows across the arid ground as hundreds of townsfolk gathered, carrying white flowers. Elena and Roberto sat together, trembling hands resting on the headstone etched with their daughter's name. "Our girl has come home," Elena whispered, her voice fragile but certain. Roberto bowed his head, a single tear falling into the dry earth, sealing 21 years of waiting. The desert wind carried the sound of sobs and prayers across the rows of graves. For Red Valley, it was the end of one story and the beginning of another, the reckoning of a town forced to confront its own blindness. The porch light at the Torres home still burned that night, but its meaning had changed. No longer was it a fragile beacon of hope for a girl returning home. Now it was a monument of truth, proof that even after decades, justice could still pierce the desert silence. The conviction of David Harper echoed far beyond Red Valley. National outlets picked up the story, framing it as a case study in both tragedy and perseverance. Analysts on crime shows dissected the investigation, marveling at how a single drop of blood, missed in 2001, had spoken louder than 2 decades of silence. Commentators called it a victory for forensic science, proof that even the oldest cold cases could breathe again when DNA spoke. But for the people who had lived the story, the headlines felt shallow. This was not a tale of science alone. It was about faith, failure, and the unbearable patience of love. Detective Elena Ramirez, whose tenacity had revived the case, was asked to speak at a forensic conference in Phoenix just months after the trial. Standing before a crowd of experts, she spoke without notes, her voice both steady and weighted. In 2001, we didn't have the tools we have today. We didn't have CODIS as we know it, or the ability to analyze degraded samples at this scale. But we did have something, evidence preserved by officers who believed in future justice. That is why Mia Torres' case was not lost, because someone believed the day would come when technology could finish what human eyes could not. Her words brought the room to a hush, followed by long applause. She later admitted in an interview that she had been thinking only of the Torres family, that their persistence had been the real catalyst, the flame that refused to die. For Elena and Roberto, life after the trial was quieter, but no less haunted. Their home remained filled with Mia's presence, her dresses still in the closet, her diary still on the desk, its last entry frozen in the optimism of youth. Elena often sat in her daughter's room, dusting each stuffed animal, straightening the books as if Mia might walk in at any moment. The hardest part was not knowing, she confessed to a reporter months later. Not knowing was worse than death. Now at least I can tell her story. Now I can let her rest. Roberto was less willing to speak. His silence had become its own form of prayer. But on anniversaries, he placed his hand on Mia's headstone and whispered words only the earth could hear. We kept our promise. We never stopped looking. Red Valley itself bore scars that no verdict could erase. The trial had forced the town to confront an uncomfortable truth. For years, they had welcomed a predator among them. At church potlucks, Harper had passed plates of food. At the Torres home, he had sat at their table. At vigils, he had held a candle and bowed his head in feigned grief. Some townsfolk struggled with guilt, asking how they had missed the signs, how they had dismissed the unease of young women who said Harper's attention felt wrong. Others were furious, realizing they had defended him even after the arrest, unwilling to let go of the image of the good neighbor. In this way, the case became more than a story about one girl. It became a reckoning about community, about listening, about the danger of mistaking outward kindness for inner truth. The annual vigil on July 12th changed after Harper's conviction. It was no longer only a plea for answers. It became a communal act of remembrance and a vow of vigilance. Families gathered with candles, yes, but also with their children, teaching them the lesson Mia's story had carved into Red Valley's soul, that silence protects predators, that truth hides in plain sight, and that justice, though late, is still worth the fight. Children born after Mia's disappearance now heard her name not as a ghost story whispered at sleepovers, but as history, a caution, a reminder of resilience. Journalists wrote retrospectives framing the case as a symbol. They called it the Red Valley Ghost, a ghost finally laid to rest by science, persistence, and love. In criminology classes across Arizona, the Mia Torres case became a study in cold case methodology, the importance of preserving evidence, the role of evolving technology, and the psychological profile of suspects who insert themselves into investigations. Forensic experts cited it in conferences, pointing to the power of CODIS, the rise of genealogical databases, and the necessity of victim advocacy. Yet for all the analysis, the story remained, at its heart, about a family who refused to let the world forget their daughter. In the quiet of their home, Elena and Roberto found fragile peace. Each July they returned to Mia's grave with white flowers, sitting from morning until dusk, telling her about the trial, the community, the prayers. As the red sun sank behind the desert mountains, Roberto placed his hand on the headstone and whispered the words that had become his vow. We didn't give up. The desert wind carried his voice, mingling with the rustle of willow branches, as if Mia herself could hear. Red Valley forever changed, no longer looked at porch lights the same way. Each glowing bulb at night carried a silent message. Protect one another, believe one another, and never turn away when something feels wrong. And in that small town, Mia's name became not just a memory, but a lesson. Proof that darkness cannot hide forever, and that even after decades, the light of truth will find its way to shine.